In the summer of 1942, on the blood-soaked shores of Guadalcanal, American Marines discovered something that would puzzle them throughout the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers, grievously wounded and barely conscious, would suddenly thrash awake in field hospitals. Their eyes wide with terror, not at their injuries, but at the realization they were still alive. Some would tear at their bandages, trying to reopen wounds. Others would weep uncontrollably, turning their faces to the wall, refusing water, refusing food, refusing to speak. The Americans didn't understand it then. They were saving lives. But to these men, survival was not salvation. It was the beginning of a shame worse than death itself. To comprehend what happened in those prison camps scattered across the Pacific, we must first understand what the Empire of Japan had done to its soldiers long before they ever saw combat. From the moment a young man was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army or Navy, he was no longer an individual. He became a living extension of the Emperor's will, a sacred instrument of divine purpose. The military indoctrination was total, relentless, and began with a single foundational principle carved into every soldier's consciousness. Death before dishonor, and surrender was the ultimate dishonor. The ideology was codified in the Senjin-kun, the military field code issued in 1941, though its principles had been taught for years before. Every soldier memorized its directives. Article 8 was unambiguous. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind you. This wasn't merely a suggestion. It was the law that governed a soldier's very soul. To be captured alive was to commit the gravest betrayal, not just of one's comrades, not just of one's family, but of the Emperor himself, who was considered divine, the living embodiment of Japan and its eternal spirit. Training reinforced this doctrine through systematic brutality. Recruits were beaten, starved, humiliated, forced to endure suffering that would break most men, all to forge them into warriors who would embrace death without hesitation. They were taught that surrender was cowardice incarnate, that prisoners of war were less than human, creatures who had forfeited their right to exist. Japanese soldiers were told that enemy forces, particularly Americans, would torture and mutilate anyone captured. Better to die fighting, or if that failed, to die by one's own hand, than to face such a fate. They were issued grenades not just for combat, but with the understanding that the final grenade should be saved. For themselves, the concept of honor in Imperial Japan was not what many Westerners understood. It wasn't merely personal integrity or courage. It was collective, binding a man to his ancestors, his family, his nation, and his emperor in an unbreakable chain of obligation. To surrender shattered that chain. It brought eternal disgrace not just upon oneself, but upon one's entire family line. Parents would be ostracized, children would be marked. The soldier's name would be stricken from family records as if he had never existed. Death in battle meant honor, enshrinement at Yasukuni, eternal glory. Capture meant oblivion, a fate literally worse than death. So when American forces pushed across the Pacific, island by island, they encountered an enemy unlike any they had faced. Japanese soldiers fought with a ferocity born of absolute conviction. They launched banzai charges into machine gun fire. They held positions until annihilated. They booby-trapped their own wounded. On Saipan in 1944, when defeat became inevitable, entire garrisons chose collective suicide. Civilians threw their children off cliffs and jumped after them rather than face capture. This was not insanity. This was the logical conclusion of everything they had been taught to believe. Yet despite this indoctrination, despite this willingness to die, prisoners were taken. Not many, especially in the early years of the war. Out of tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers killed on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured. At Tarawa, the Marine Corps suffered over 3,000 casualties, taking an island defended by nearly 5,000 Japanese troops. Only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers were captured alive. The numbers tell a story of an army that meant what it said about death before dishonor. But those who were captured shared a common thread. Almost none surrendered voluntarily in the conventional sense. They were found unconscious from blood loss, trapped under debris from artillery strikes, concussed from explosions, delirious with fever or infection. Some had been shot in the head and somehow survived. Others had attempted suicide, pulling grenade pins only to have the explosive malfunction, or shooting themselves only to have the bullet miss vital areas in the chaos of battle. They were captured not because they chose survival, but because their bodies betrayed their will to die. When they woke in American field hospitals or prisoner-holding areas, the psychological collapse was immediate and profound. Navy corpsmen and Army medics reported the same pattern again and again. A wounded Japanese soldier would regain consciousness, realize where he was, and begin screaming. Not in pain, though many were grievously injured, but in anguish at being alive. They would beg to be killed. They would refuse treatment, fighting the medics trying to save them. Some would attempt to strangle themselves with their own bandages. Others would try to starve themselves to death, turning away food and water for days. American personnel were bewildered. They had been trained to expect that prisoners of war would be grateful for medical care, relieved to be out of combat, willing to cooperate in exchange for decent treatment. The Geneva Conventions, which the United States followed even though Japan had not ratified the relevant protocols, ensured that POWs received food, shelter, and medical care. American camps were not paradises, but compared to the brutal conditions in Japanese POW camps holding Allied prisoners, they were humane. Yet the Japanese prisoners acted as if they had been condemned to hell itself. The psychological breakdown manifested in different ways. Some prisoners became catatonic, staring at nothing, unresponsive to questions or kindness. They had been taught that as prisoners they were already dead, and they behaved like ghosts, hollow and unreachable. Others became violently self-destructive, requiring restraints to prevent suicide attempts. Still others wept continuously, consumed by shame so deep that it devoured everything else. Many refused to give even their names, as if speaking their identity would make the disgrace real. American interrogators, intelligence officers, and military psychiatrists struggled to understand. Early reports described the prisoners as fanatical, brainwashed, mentally unstable. But as more prisoners were taken and the patterns repeated themselves across every theater of the Pacific War, a clearer picture emerged. These men weren't insane. They were trapped in an impossible psychological prison, one constructed by their own military and culture. They had been conditioned to believe that their lives had value only as long as they served the emperor's will. Once captured, that purpose vanished. They became nothing. Less than nothing. Walking disgraces. On Saipan, where intense fighting in June and July of 1944 left the island littered with Japanese dead and where mass civilian suicides shocked even hardened combat veterans, American forces captured several thousand Japanese military personnel and civilians. The prisoners were a mix of wounded soldiers found unconscious, stragglers who collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration, and men who had been too badly injured to complete their own suicides. One captured officer, asked through a translator why he hadn't killed himself, replied that he had tried 3 times. He had shot himself in the head, but the bullet had only grazed his skull. He had detonated a grenade, but the blast had been absorbed by bodies around him. He had tried to drown himself in shallow water, but lost consciousness and washed ashore. Now, he said, he was simply waiting to die, because a man who had failed even at suicide was cursed by heaven itself. The interrogation process revealed layers of cultural misunderstanding. American intelligence officers wanted tactical information, troop movements, unit strengths, fortification locations. They approached interrogation with a combination of pragmatism and often genuine curiosity about their enemy. Many had studied Japanese language and culture. They knew how to ask questions, how to cross-reference answers, how to build rapport. What they hadn't anticipated was how readily many prisoners would talk once they accepted their status. For the Japanese soldiers, once the initial shock wore off and they understood they were not going to be immediately tortured and executed, a strange transformation occurred. If they were already dead in the eyes of their nation and their families, if their names were already being erased from family registries back home, if they had already committed the ultimate betrayal, then there was no point in maintaining military discipline. Some prisoners, particularly after 1943, when the war turned decisively against Japan, became remarkably cooperative. They would provide detailed information about defenses, unit compositions, even strategic plans. They reasoned that they had already lost their honor completely, so there was no additional honor to preserve by staying silent. This wasn't universal. Some prisoners maintained discipline, refused to speak beyond name and rank, held onto their military identity as the last thread of meaning in their shattered existence. But the number who cooperated surprised American intelligence services. These weren't cowards or traitors by nature. They were men whose entire worldview had collapsed. If the foundation of their identity, their relationship to the emperor and their nation, had been destroyed by capture, then the rules that governed military conduct no longer applied to them. They were already erased from history. Many expressed the sentiment that since they were dead men walking, there was a strange freedom in having nothing left to lose. The Americans tried various approaches to manage their Japanese POWs. At camps established in Hawaii, in Australia, in the Aleutian Islands, and eventually in the continental United States, efforts were made to provide not just physical care, but psychological rehabilitation. Some camps employed Nisei translators, Japanese Americans who served with distinction in the U.S. military despite their own communities being interned. These translators became crucial bridges, helping to explain American intentions and interpreting the prisoners' often incomprehensible responses to camp administrators. But the Nisei themselves were sometimes viewed with suspicion and contempt by the POWs. To the Japanese soldiers, these were race traitors, Japanese by blood who had sided with the enemy. The cultural gulf was immense. The Nisei had grown up in America, had absorbed American values of individualism and democracy, even while facing discrimination and later internment. The prisoners had grown up in Imperial Japan, steeped in militarism and emperor worship. They inhabited different moral universes despite sharing a language and ancestral homeland. Food became a battleground of its own. American rations, plentiful by Japanese military standards, where soldiers often subsisted on rice and little else, were initially refused by many prisoners. Some refused because they were actively trying to starve themselves. Others refused because accepting food from the enemy felt like collaboration. Still others, weakened by months or years of poor nutrition during their service, found American food, heavy with meat and dairy products uncommon in traditional Japanese diet, physically difficult to digest. Camp administrators had to learn to provide rice and vegetables to make meals that wouldn't be rejected on sight. Medical treatment created similar challenges. Wounded prisoners who would have died from infections with minimal Japanese military medical care often survived thanks to American medicine, antibiotics, blood transfusions, and surgery. But surviving meant continuing to live in shame. Some prisoners expressed the wish that the doctors had let them die. They saw American medical care not as compassion, but as a cruel extension of their suffering. They would have preferred a quick death on the battlefield to the prolonged agony of dishonored survival. Yet over time, something unexpected began to happen in the camps. As months turned into years and the initial trauma of capture faded, some prisoners began to adapt. They formed communities within the camps. They established routines. Some learned English. Others took up hobbies, crafts, even studies. American authorities, surprised by their cooperation, began employing some prisoners in work details, in maintenance, in agriculture. The prisoners worked diligently, often commenting that work gave them purpose, something to do besides contemplate their disgrace. Letters from home never came. Japanese military doctrine treated captured soldiers as dead, and their families were instructed to do the same. But within the camps, friendships formed. Arguments erupted. Factions developed between those who maintained faith in Japan's ultimate victory and those who began to see the war's trajectory clearly. Access to news, even filtered and delayed, showed them that Japan was losing. Island by island, the empire was being pushed back. American bombers were striking the home islands. Some prisoners began to question whether their sacrifice had meant anything at all. On Okinawa in 1945, the final major battle before the planned invasion of Japan itself, the ferocity reached its peak. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians died. Kamikaze attacks intensified. Pilots turned into guided missiles in a final expression of the death before dishonor creed. Yet even here, prisoners were taken. Thousands of them. soldiers who had passed out from wounds, who had been buried in collapsed tunnels and dug out by American engineers, who had hidden in caves until starvation forced them out. Each one carried the same look when captured, the same horror at still being alive. Then in August 1945, the atomic bombs fell. Hiroshima on the 6th, Nagasaki on the 9th. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation by radio for the first time in history. In formal classical Japanese that many ordinary citizens could barely understand, he announced Japan's surrender, speaking of enduring the unendurable and suffering what could not be suffered. For the prisoners in camps around the Pacific and in the United States, the news was devastating in a different way. Japan had surrendered. The unthinkable had happened. The divine emperor had ordered his forces to lay down arms. Some prisoners refused to believe it. They claimed it was American propaganda, a cruel trick. But others, hearing the emperor's own voice on recordings played in the camps, could not deny reality. If the emperor himself had ordered surrender, then what had their shame been for? If Japan itself had surrendered, were they still traitors, or had the entire nation joined them in dishonor? The psychological impact was profound. Some prisoners who had maintained rigid military bearing for years collapsed emotionally. Others felt a strange, guilty relief. The war was over. They would eventually go home. But what kind of home waited for them? American officers who had worked with the prisoners for years observed the transformation. Some reported that the most fanatical prisoners, those who had maintained absolute loyalty to the emperor and confidence in victory, seemed almost liberated by the surrender. The cognitive dissonance of their situation had been resolved. They were no longer traitors who had violated the code. They were defeated soldiers whose emperor had ordered them to accept defeat. The shame shifted from personal to collective, and somehow that made it bearable. If everyone had lost, then individual disgrace didn't matter as much. The repatriation process began slowly. Ships carrying prisoners back to Japan revealed men who had been transformed by captivity, not in the ways American authorities had hoped, through democratic re-education and acceptance of American values, but in more fundamental ways. They had survived something they had been trained to believe was unsurvivable. They had lived through the unlivable. Some had retained their core beliefs, still revering the emperor, still proud of their service. Others had become bitter, angry at the military that had indoctrinated them into a code that made survival impossible. Still others had simply gone numb, existing but not truly living. Returning to Japan, they found a nation in ruins. Cities burned by firebombing, Hiroshima and Nagasaki reduced to atomic shadows, millions dead, millions more displaced, the emperor still on his throne but stripped of divinity, transformed by American occupation into a constitutional monarch, a symbol rather than a god. Japan was being remade, its militarism purged, its society reformed. In this chaos, the returning POWs were just a few more displaced people in a sea of refugees and survivors. But the stigma remained. Families often greeted returning prisoners with shame rather than joy. The old beliefs died hard. Even if Japan had surrendered, even if the emperor had submitted to occupation, the individual shame of capture persisted in social memory. Some veterans lied about their wartime experiences, claiming they had been wounded and hospitalized rather than captured. Others retreated into silence, never speaking of the war, of captivity, of the psychological hell they had endured. The men who had believed capture was worse than death had survived, but survival had marked them forever. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt and transformed into an economic power, as the war generation aged and passed, these stories remained largely untold. Japanese culture, focused on rebuilding and looking forward, had little space for dwelling on the war's individual traumas. The men who had been prisoners carried their experiences privately, many taking their stories to the grave. Some found ways to make peace with what had happened. Others never did, living out their lives under the shadow of a shame that never fully lifted. What happened to Japanese prisoners of war in American custody reveals something profound about the nature of ideology and its power to shape human consciousness. These soldiers had been taught so thoroughly, so completely, that capture was worse than death, that when they survived it, they couldn't function. Their minds couldn't process a reality that contradicted everything they had been conditioned to believe. The indoctrination hadn't just taught them facts or instilled discipline, it had fundamentally altered how they understood themselves, their worth, their place in the universe. The Americans who dealt with these prisoners, from the Marines who first captured them, to the intelligence officers who interrogated them, to the camp administrators who housed them, witnessed something that challenged their own assumptions about human nature. They had believed that all humans shared certain basic desires, survival chief among them, that self-preservation was an instinct that transcended culture. But the Japanese prisoners demonstrated that culture and ideology could override even the most basic human instincts, could make death preferable to life, could turn survival into suffering. What the Japanese military had done to its soldiers was create men who could not surrender their beliefs, even when those beliefs destroyed them. The training had been so effective that it outlasted battlefield defeat, outlasted physical injury, outlasted capture itself. Even in the relative safety of American POW camps, even when treated with the basic decency required by international law, the prisoners could not escape the psychological prison their own military had constructed inside their minds. Yet the human spirit, resilient and adaptable, found ways to survive even this. Over time, even in the face of conditioning that powerful, some men found paths to accommodate their new reality. They reframed their understanding, reinterpreted their experiences, found new meanings that let them continue living. The process was painful, incomplete, often unsuccessful. But it happened. Because ultimately, humans are meaning-making creatures, and even when every source of meaning has been stripped away, we construct new ones from the ruins. The story of Japanese POWs in World War II is not a story of cultural superiority or inferiority. It's not a story that flatters either side. For the Americans, it revealed the limits of good intentions and humane treatment when facing an enemy shaped by radically different values. For the Japanese, it revealed the cost of militarism and fanaticism, how ideology can poison an entire generation and turn honor into a weapon against the self. For all of us looking back, it stands as a warning about what happens when states control not just the actions, but the very thoughts of their citizens. When loyalty to nation or leader supersedes the value of individual human life. The men who believed capture was worse than death and then found themselves captured had to discover whether life could have meaning without honor, whether identity could survive the shattering of every certainty, whether a man whose name had been erased from his family's records could still be a person. Some found affirmative answers, some didn't. But they all had to ask the questions, and in asking them, they revealed something essential about the human condition under extremity. War reshaped honor for these men in ways neither they nor their captors anticipated. The rigid code that had governed their lives proved unable to accommodate the reality of survival. In the end, they had to choose whether to remain faithful to a code that had betrayed them or to forge new understandings that allowed them to live. That choice, made in POW camps across the Pacific, in the years after repatriation, in the private chambers of individual consciousness, defined who they became after the war ended. The story haunts us because it asks what any of us would do if the foundations of our identity were shattered. If everything we believed about ourselves turned out to be incompatible with survival. The Japanese prisoners of war found themselves in that impossible position, and they teach us that ideology, however powerful, however deeply instilled, eventually confronts the stubborn fact of continued existence. How we make peace with that existence, how we construct meaning from the ruins of former certainties, how we learn to live when we believed we should have died, these are the questions that transcend the specific history of the Pacific War and speak to the universal human struggle to find purpose in the face of suffering. They were soldiers who believed capture was worse than death. They were captured anyway, and then they had to learn to live with it. Their stories, uncomfortable and challenging as they are, remind us that honor and humanity are not always the same thing, that survival can require surrendering certainties we thought defined us, and that sometimes the hardest battle is not the one fought with weapons, but the one fought within the landscape of the mind, where ideology and identity collide with the simple, persistent fact of being alive. Content is user-generated and unverified.